Ladies and gentlemen, drivers, gig workers, and everyone in between, welcome to This Week in Rideshare podcast. I'm your host, Jared Hoffa. It is Friday, January 16th, and this week, drivers protest Waymo, Uber faces trial, and Uber and drivers could lose up to $550 million. Legal Rideshare breaks it down. And from Legal Rideshare, I'm joined by the co-founder and lead attorney, Bryant Greening. Bryant, happy Friday.
Happy Friday, Jared. Great to be back.
It is. This is a interesting week. I always feel like as the season gets colder, the stories get colder and more brutal, and this week is no exception.
I think that's exactly right. I think as we chill, the stories get chillier.
Right?
So,
Exactly.
yeah,
In like a lion, out like a lamb. Is that the saying for the
I
weather?
have not heard that one, but I'm going to start using it. So thank you for introducing it.
I feel like that's a Pennsylvania term, probably. I don't know, but it feels like it is.
It
Um,
is certainly not an Illinois one.
yes, that's true. All right, we're going to jump in. And Brian, this first story is interesting because we're starting to see the rumblings of drivers now. And this is from AP News that is reporting that drivers are protesting Waymo. So drivers for Lyft and Uber are protesting the self-driving Waymo taxis in San Francisco on Friday, last Friday. They were urging state regulators to exercise greater oversight of autonomous vehicles, given recent events in which cars killed pets and blocked traffic. About 24 drivers and supporters spoke or held up signs calling for safer streets and greater accountability outside the offices of the California Public Utilities Commission. A steady stream of Waymo cars drove past the protest, a testament to the growing ubiquity of the white cars in San Francisco. Now, Brian, the reason I think this is so interesting is that this is at least the first time that I'm hearing that drivers are now starting to get visually affected by the Waymo vehicles. Yes, we know people were using them. Yes, they started to grow, but it seems like it's now finally hitting the pockets of drivers.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. We're now seeing that drivers are feeling the burden of these cars on the street. I think it's affecting drivers' bottom line. It's affecting the amount of rides that they're getting, perhaps making it so that they have to work more hours in order to earn what they used to. So it does not surprise me that drivers are starting to protest and starting to demand what they consider to be fair play. Uh, way back when Uber and Lyft stormed onto the market and displaced taxi drivers. And back then, taxi drivers were protesting Uber and Lyft, saying it's not fair that they're held to different standards. It's not fair that that they don't have the same regulations that we have. And frankly, the taxis were right back then. But we saw what happened where the Uber and Lyft models wiped out the taxi industry. We've had a decade plus of rideshare as we know it. And I think those drivers are now sensing the same fear that the taxi workers way back when faced. So hopefully these drivers can band together to demand fairness, equal playing field for their line of work. Because if they don't, if the regulators uh, don't level this, it is the rideshare driver who's eventually going to be displaced. Whether it's now, a year from now, 10 years from now, eventually it'll happen because the autonomous vehicles are here. They're not going anywhere. And the workers sense that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at they interviewed a driver in the article. And I mean, you could if they didn't say the word autonomous vehicle, you could have plucked this quote from 10, 11, 12 years ago. The quote says, and this is from a driver who drives for both Uber and Lyft. He said, "We have these people, these companies who are driving around the city and they don't seem to be held to the same standards as us drivers." I mean, that could be 12 years ago with an interview of a taxi driver talking about Uber drivers. And now
Yeah.
it's the Uber driver talking about autonomous vehicles. So,
And what's scary for the worker is a lot of the taxi drivers way back when they became Uber and Lyft drivers. They adapted. But with this technology, there's not a place for the driver. So once Waymo takes over, once autonomous vehicles are the primary source of transportation for rideshare, the rideshare driver goes away. There's not another place for them to go. So it is really do or die. And I think it's important that drivers are getting their voices out there now, because they're going to be sorry if they don't try to demand regulation, level playing field, and their jobs go away. Now is the time. Rise up if this is something that you believe in. If regulation is something that you demand, tell the regulators, raise your voice up, stand on the streets. I think that these drivers are doing exactly what they need to do to try to survive.
Yeah, and actually, that's a really good point. I didn't even really think about that. So yeah, couldn't agree more. Stakes are obviously getting very high. Moving on, another pretty interesting turning point here. Uber is facing a sexual assault trial in Arizona. Reuters reported, quote, Uber is set to face trial this week in Arizona. A lawsuit brought by a woman who says she was sexually assaulted by a driver she booked through the app. The trial will be the first test of Uber's efforts to shield itself from liability for alleged assaults committed by its drivers, with thousands of cases pending in U.S. federal court. Uber is facing more than 3,000 lawsuits over similar claims that have been consolidated in federal court. The outcome of the litigation could weigh on Uber's balance sheet and complicate its relationships with regulators and investors who have closely tracked its safety record. So this seems like a pretty big deal. And Brian, if you want to explain why this is such a turning point for this litigation.
Yeah, this is a massive case. So when we talk about a bellwether case, what we're talking about is a case that is plucked from one of many that are similar. So you can see these in cases like here with the sexual assault claims. There was one that I was following recently involving technology that apparently went awry. It was like a hearing aid where thousands of people were claiming that there were issues with the hearing aid, and they took one of those cases, tried it in front of a jury, and that jury then decides, is this a viable case, and can all those other ones move forward into the trial stage? Here, we're going to have a jury that's going to say, is Uber as a corporation liable for sexual assaults that occur on the platform? For the longest time, they have said, we do a lot to try to make our app safe. We do background checks. We try to remove drivers who have poor ratings. And we are not responsible for the criminal acts of third parties. This jury is going to decide whether Uber has done enough, whether it has knowledge of the criminal acts, and whether it is criminal, not criminally, civilly liable for not protecting passengers when passengers are harmed by drivers. If the jury were to find that Uber can be held civilly liable, and that means have to pay big dollars to victims, that's going to open up a ton of cases where people have been victimized by their drivers, and that's going to be a significant burden on Uber's bottom line. So it makes plenty of sense why people are talking about this as a big deal. It makes a ton of sense why investors are looking at it, because if Uber is responsible anytime that there's a criminal act inside its car, its legal liability and potential to have to pay significant damages just went way up.
Yeah, and I'm looking here at Uber's response, and they say, Uber has argued it can't be held liable for criminal conduct because its background checks and disclosures about assaults are sufficient. But wasn't there stories before about basically there's huge flaws in the background checks and huge flaws in any sort of disclosures? So it seems like their argument is, oh, we don't, the backgrounds are enough, but we know previously the backgrounds were never enough. You know,
Well, I think it depends on the particular evidence that comes out in this case, but I can tell you it's my position that Uber presents itself as a safe product. They market themselves as safety first. They encourage people to ride in their vehicles because it's a safe way to get from point A to point B. And then they take extra steps to try to advertise that. They say, we do background checks, we remove drivers who have red flags. If they are advertising themselves in one way and then cutting corners when it comes to actually making the product safe, not doing a thorough job when they've accepted the responsibility to do so, that could be a big problem for them in this trial. And I think it's really going to come down to the evidence that the plaintiff's attorney can put on about how Uber presents itself in one way and actually delivers a product that's not nearly as safe as they claim to be.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. And as I usually say, time will tell on these things. But yeah, this is a very, as you said, bellwether case, and I'm sure it's going to be in the news in the future, regardless of which way it goes. And our final story today, yet another pretty hot one here. Uber Eats and DoorDash are under fire for allegedly curtailing tips. Now, this is from Seeking Alpha, and they report, quote, a New York City Department of Consumer and Worker Protection alleges that Uber and DoorDash designed their customer interfaces in a way that discouraged tipping, which has resulted in more than 550 million in lost gratitudes for delivery drivers. They said our report blows the whistle on a massive scheme by Uber and DoorDash to drive down worker pay by more than 550 million. Under new worker protection laws regarding tips, third-party food and grocery delivery apps must offer a 10% tip option and allow tipping before or during order placement. Employers must also ensure timely pay of tips and are prohibited from keeping the gratitudes or using tip credits if workers spend significant time on non-tip duties. So they go into more detail here, but yeah, if this is true, and again, they're saying allegedly because it's going to court here, or at least likely to. This is a pretty big deal.
It is a big deal. And I think, first of all, we have to see how this plays out. We have to see, we don't know exactly what these new regulations require. There's always nuance. And I'm sure Uber's going to say that they have done everything that they need to do to comply with the law. What I think this highlights, however, is that clearly the law was intended to encourage tips for vulnerable workers, workers who are underpaid, workers who don't make enough without those tips coming in. And Uber is at the very least not complying with the spirit of the regulation. And why are they doing that? They're doing that to the detriment of the driver because they are trying to appease the consumer. They're trying to appease the people who are delivering, who complain about being bombarded with tip requests. I think it's just another example of Uber choosing the customer over the worker, when in fact the worker is what makes their companies boom. It's not that customers are going to deliver or are going to order delivery, whether it's on Uber apps or from the restaurant themselves or whatever. It's the driver who's making Uber's business what it is. And they need to spend a lot more time figuring out ways to ensure that the driver is taken care of, can make a livable wage, and that when there are rules and regulations to help support that worker, to help keep money in their pocket, to help make money when there's not much that Uber and Lyft are taking money out of their pockets every day, they should be complying with both the letter of the law and the spirit of the law, because their worker needs it, and really fairness and equity and fair play all require it. So I just see this as a broader problem where Uber looks ways to cut corners at the in favor of the customer and against the driver.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking again at this, and this is, I think, even a bigger issue. They're saying that after these changes that they made, tips decreased to, which is insane to me. They averaged 76 cents for a delivery tip, which is basically nothing, um, compared to an average tip of $2, which is also not great. I feel like a lot of times when you're doing delivery, especially in bad weather or snow, like you're doing it because you don't want to go do something that you're telling someone else to go do. So it's crazy to me that just in general, these tips for delivery drivers are really low. Um,
Right. Yeah.
definitely an issue there.
It is. And I think the reason why these regulations exist is to remind people or encourage people to tip. It's not forcing anybody to tip. Just the fact that the tip option shows up right when you order, in the middle of the order, and then at the end after it's been delivered, is that really offensive to anybody? Like, if you don't want to tip, don't tip. But to have the three reminders really, I think, encourages people to think about this worker who's putting themselves out there in often in harm's way. I'm thinking about the weather in Chicago a few nights ago. We ordered delivery because we didn't want to go pick up food. We didn't want to get on the roads. The roads were wet and slippery. Somebody else brought it to us. You better bet that we tip that person because we understand that they're out there, they're doing a service, they're working hard, and they deserve it. That's how we feel. I was glad to click the tip option when it popped up. And, I don't think that a couple reminders is such a bad thing.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Yeah, we'll see. That again, if they win this or it goes through, it's quite a hefty move and can lead to the app being better. So we will see. But that is the end of the articles for this week. But of course, Brian, I will give you the final say before we head into the weekend.
Yeah, always remind everybody to reach out to Legal Rideshare immediately if you find yourself injured in a car accident or otherwise on an Uber, Lyft, or other gig-related activity. We represent drivers, passengers, and victims. These cases require solid foundations, meaning contact us so we can start collecting evidence. We can open up insurance claims, make sure that everything's going well with the treatment that you need. And at the end of the case, we help maximize the recovery, the money that goes into your pocket. All of our contact information is on our website, legalrideshare.com. And as I've said, do not hesitate. Please reach out right away.
Thank you, Brian. And as I like to say, that is the end of this week in Rideshare. See you next week.